the Gemara today is very similar to the Gemara yesterday. And the Gemara yesterday, we brought a few cases where we're trying to figure out the specific opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, Reb Meir, Reb Yossi. We clarified exactly which Mishnah goes according to which rabbi. And we didn't have 100% proof, maybe, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, but we can assume he probably followed his rabbi's view. In Reb Meir, we have that view, which is the most lenient view. We had Rabbi Yossi, who was the most stringent view. And so it seemed like we had a pretty decent assumption of which rabbi is the author of the different Mishnahs. So, for example, we brought a Mishnah about a person who's deaf, who's trying to separate truma, and he has to say a bracha. And it said that it's better if a deaf person doesn't separate truma because he can't hear his bracha. Which opinion did that go according to? So the final conclusion that we ended off yesterday was that that's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that says it's preferable not to separate truma if you are unable to hear your bracha. That was Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. That was the Gemara's final assumption. Then there's another case where it said that a deaf person is allowed to separate truma, even preferably. Who did that go like? So that, we said, went like Rabbi Meir, because we found that Rabbi Meir said a law regarding reciting Shema, that you don't have to hear yourself, you don't have to hear, it doesn't have to be audible to you, that you would hear it. And so if Reb Meir said that regarding Shema, the Gemara assumes that this might be his opinion, this probably is his view regarding Truma, that it said a person who's deaf has no problem separating Truma, is fine, preferable for him to separate Truma. It would make sense. That's Reb Meir. Reb Meir said, Shema, you don't have to hear yourself saying. So the same thing would apply to Truma. So we figured out that the author of the Mishnah that says that Truma better a deaf person shouldn't separate Truma, we came to the conclusion that's probably Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe. And the other Mishnah that said that a deaf person can separate Truma, even preferably, that's Reb Meir. And then we also had a brisa about Berchas HaMazon, that it's preferable not to recite Berchas HaMazon, grace after meals, if you can't hear it. But if you said it and you didn't hear it, you're yaitze, you have fulfilled your obligation. So who would the author of that brisa be? It's also Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So we're basically trying to match the names with the statements. And the Gemara now is going to bring another case that we didn't mention, and it's about reading the Megillah. And the Gemara is going to redo all the statements that many of the statements that we said yesterday. The Gemara is sort of going to bring them up again and say, well, what about this? And what about that? And so it seems to me that this Gemara that we're learning today maybe was studied in a different academy than the previous Gemara, and therefore it sort of like has to redo all these statements because it comes to the same conclusion in the end, but it sounds like it doesn't remember anything that we said yesterday. So it seems to me like it might have been, maybe it was a it's a statement studied by other rabbis came up with the same thing that these rabbis came up with, and they had one extra Mishnah in Megillah. They had one extra statement that they had to reconcile and fit and figure out. So you'll see what I'm saying. We're gonna start 3 lines up from the bottom of the page. We're on page 15A, probably 15A6, maybe in the art scroll, I'm guessing, or 15A5. I don't know which one, but it's 3 lines up from the bottom of the page. Tanan Hassam, we learned over there regarding the Megillah, reading the Megillah. So again, 15A, the bottom of 15A, Tanan Hassam, we learned over there. Hakol Ksherim Likrei says HaMegillah. Everyone is kosher to read the Megillah, Chutz Mecheresh Shaita V'Katan, except a deaf person, a Shaita is, how does the art scroll translate Shaita?
Imbecile.
Imbecile. V'Katan, and a child. So these 3 people cannot read the Megillah, and we're not just talking about for them to read it for themselves. We're mainly talking about for them to read it for others.
Right.
So now, cheresh, I mentioned to you once before, sometimes means just deaf. Often it means deaf and mute. What do you think here? Which one is it? Is cheresh here, are we talking about someone who's deaf only, or are they deaf and mute?
Deaf and mute. That's what
yeah. That's what Steinsaltz says.
right.
Yeah.
Well, I have a problem with that. That's what they're translating? Because
Yes.
How did they read the Megillah if they're deaf and mute?
They knew.
Sign language?
No, they didn't have that then.
I was asking this as a joke. I'm shocked that the Steinsaltz says deaf and mute. I was actually joking when I asked this question. Is that really what it says? Deaf and mute in the
That's really
Steinsaltz?
what it says. It's weird.
Okay, well, I was thinking of this as a trick question, and I thought everyone was going to say just deaf, because how did they read the Megillah if they're mute? But that's interesting. I'll have to look. Does he have any
It
notes?
depends if they read for themselves. It depends if they read for themselves or they
So that-
read for the public.
Right, but then that would
For
mean that,
themselves, they can read
well,
because
they
they
could
can
read
see
with their eyes.
right, but I don't think
with
that,
their eyes. They can see.
Okay, that's interesting. I was not going to translate it with reading with the eyes, because the common view is that reading with the eyes is totally not acceptable. Although there is a statement from Maimonides that it's one view versus all the other rabbis that seems to have a possibility and to read with the eyes, but all the other rabbis argue on that, and that's why I was not going to translate this.
Can
that
I
way.
project? I wonder if it's possible, if they weren't born deaf or mute, that it happened later on, that they did hear before and learn. In other words, it doesn't really say anything about how this, in other words, it says deaf mute, but it doesn't say that it's somebody born that way.
Okay, well, I don't think it would make a
matter.
difference, because if they're mute now, they
They
can't
still
read the
can
Megillah,
read.
or if they were mute when they were born, they can't read the Megillah. It doesn't seem to make a difference in this, you know what I mean, regarding this. Yes, Robert.
I guess the question for me is the text referring to somebody who does it privately, or does it as a leader within the reading the Megillah to those present in his
That's
presence?
what I'm saying.
Well,
Because that would then maybe deal with being mute. Being mute, you read it to yourself is one thing that does not deny you
Yeah.
of doing that. But if you can't read it for everybody else, that then denies them the ability to hear you do it on their behalf.
right. The only thing is, if we're talking about actually reciting it with your lips,
Right.
then it doesn't
doesn't
matter. You
matter
do it for
then?
yourself. If you did it yourself or you did it for someone else, how did you move your lips if you're mute? Unless someone who's mute means they can't give off sound, but they actually can move their lips. Could that be something? I don't know. I would be a
No.
little
They
surprised.
can.
Now, I see a lot of people who read who are not making any verbalization, but they're moving their lips.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, in their mind's eye, they're verbalizing it, let's say.
Right. Well, and regarding your other point, Robert, are we talking about someone who is having someone else in mind, or they're reading for themselves? The commentary over here, Tosfos on the side, definitely assumes that the Mishnah here that we're reading is talking about having others in mind.
Right. No, I read that.
And
yes.
so that's the common understanding here, is that we're dealing with fulfilling the mitzvah for others, which is very interesting. So this Mishnah says that everyone can read the Megillah for others and fulfill the mitzvah for others, except a cheresh, the deaf person, a shaita, an imbecile, and a katan, a child. Rabbi Yehuda machshir b'katan. Rabbi Yehuda permits a child to read the Megillah for others.
Yeah, that's.
And this is an interesting discussion about a child, because generally we say that a child is obligated in mitzvahs rabbinically, not biblically. They're a child, they're underage. So, but they're obligated rabbinically in mitzvahs. The rabbis said that children should do mitzvahs, and therefore the children are obligated rabbinically in mitzvahs. Now, reading the Megillah is also a rabbinic obligation, right? Because it doesn't say it in the Torah to read the Megillah. The story of Purim happened well after the Torah was finalized in Moses' days, when God, completed the Torah to Moshe, and Moshe passed away, and it was and that's the end of the Torah. The Megillah is a book afterwards, and the Megillah, it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah to read the Megillah. Therefore, the Megillah is a rabbinic obligation. And so the question would be, why can't a child who's obligated rabbinically fulfill the mitzvah for others who are also obligated rabbinically? Let me preface that with another case. There is a law that if a child has to say grace after meals, and an adult has to say grace after meals, a child sometimes can fulfill the obligation for the adult, and the adult can say amen, and the child can fulfill the obligation for the adult in some cases, but in some cases not. When can a child fulfill the obligation for an adult? Again, the child is going to say grace after meals, and he's going to have in mind the adult, and the adult is going to say amen to the blessings of grace after meals, and the child, some cases, would be able to fulfill the obligation for the adult. And the cases where he's able to fulfill the obligation for the adult is if the adult is only saying grace after meals as a rabbinic obligation. But if the adult is saying grace after meals as a biblical obligation, then the child who's only rabbinically obligated cannot fulfill the obligation for the adult who's biblically obligated. In other words, only a rabbinic obligated person can fulfill the obligation for another rabbinic obligated person. But if the child who is rabbinically obligated wants to fulfill the obligation for an adult who's obligated biblically, then they can't. So when is a person obligated biblically to say grace after meals? If they eat enough for satisfaction, they're satisfied. They ate bread until they were satisfied. When is an adult obligated only rabbinically to say grace after meals? If they ate a kezias, olive-sized piece of bread. So if a person eats an olive-sized piece of bread, are they obligated to say grace after meals? Only rabbinically, not biblically. Because biblically it says, v'achalta v'savata ubeirachta. You ate, you were satisfied, you blessed. So only if you're satisfied do you have to say grace after meals biblically. But rabbinically, if you eat a olive-sized portion of bread, then you would recite the grace after meals rabbinically. So can a child fulfill the obligation for an adult to say grace after meals? If the adult only ate an olive-sized piece of bread, but he wasn't satisfied, the child can actually fulfill the obligation for the adult. So here, when it comes to Megillah, what do you think? Can a child reading the Megillah fulfill the obligation for an adult? What do you think? Well, Megillah is a rabbinic obligation, and a child is a rabbinic obligation. So let the child fulfill the obligation. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah.
He should be able to, right?
I think I heard on Purim that if nobody else is around to read the Megillah for his mother or for somebody in the family that didn't hear it, that he is allowed to read it for them.
Even under bar mitzvah.
Yes.
I'm not sure what the halacha is. That's interesting. But I'm just mentioning this as part of, because the Gemara brings it, and it brings an argument. Rabbi Yehuda says that a child could fulfill the obligation for an adult to hear the Megillah. Now, because a child is obligated rabbinically and an adult is obligated rabbinically. However, the Tana Kama, the first opinion, says no. Everyone can fulfill the obligation of reading the Megillah for others, except a cheresh, shoita, and a katan, and a child. A child cannot read the Megillah for others, according to the Tana Kama, the first view. And what would the reason be? And Tosfos over here is very bothered. Why can't a child fulfill the obligation for an adult? They're both obligated rabbinically. Let the child fulfill the obligation for the adult. And Tosfos says something very interesting. He says it depends how you view the rabbinic obligation of a child to read the Megillah. Is it viewed as a clear-cut rabbinic obligation for a child, or is it a indirect obligation? Why? Because number one, the rabbi said children have to do mitzvahs. And number two, the rabbi said, well, there is a mitzvah of reading Megillah. So once the rabbi said reading the Megillah is a mitzvah, and the rabbis also said children should do all mitzvahs, is that considered a double rabbinic obligation for a child to fulfill the obligation of reading the Megillah? It's sort of like indirect. They need two steps. There's, first of all, there's an obligation to read Megillah. Second of all, children have to do mitzvahs. Both of these steps are considered two rabbinic obligations that ultimately lead to the obligation of a child to read the Megillah, while an adult to read the Megillah is only one step, is only one rabbinic obligation. So a child is double set apart from the obligation of reading the Megillah, while an adult is only one step away from reading the Megillah. And therefore, the first opinion of the rabbis, the first opinion of the Mishnah says, no, a child cannot read the Megillah for an adult, because a child's obligation of reading the Megillah stems from two rabbinic obligations, and an adult's obligation to read the Megillah stems from one rabbinic obligation. So they're not in the same league. They're not in the same level, and therefore a child cannot fulfill the obligation for an adult, while the Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's a rabbinic obligation. You can fulfill the obligation for another adult. You have no problem. So these are the two views that we just read. Yes, Robert.
In my reading, there's again two different opinions of again what is when a child is in, I guess, what is it, in training. There's something about is qualified to read the Megillah. So what is the distinction? Does that mean there's somebody who's preparing for the bar mitzvah? So therefore,
no.
That's
good question. There is a concept of a child who is higia lechinuch, which Robert is translating as in training. He reached the level of education. And then there's a child who hasn't reached the level of education. Yeah. And the child who's reached the level of education means a child who could sit through Megillah reading and hear and listen to every word. So that's a certain age, almost
so
like
a kid who doesn't have shpilkes, right? A kid who doesn't have shpilkes can do it, right?
Right. So exactly. It depends on the situation. Each mitzvah goes on that level. So for example, a child who can shake the lulav, he's obligated in the lulav because he's reached the level of chinuch. Now, what does that mean? He can shake the lulav. He knows the different directions of shaking the lulav. That's his if he can remember and know how to shake it in the different 6 directions, then he's obligated to shake the lulav. And that's
So it
so
comes
certain
down to,
kids,
right,
you would say is age of 6. Other kids would say 7. Other kids might be at 7. Depends on their mental maturity.
right. So it's consciousness of understanding their role within Judaism, within the synagogue. So it's that consciousness, that
Not
they understand.
not exactly the role within Judaism. It's the ability to do the
Right.
action of the mitzvah.
Right, that's what I mean, right.
Their
within the-
ability to
yeah.
know how to do the action of this mitzvah. Can they
Understanding what the performance means.
not what it means,
No.
what it entails,
Okay, all right,
what it
good enough.
entails.
Right, you're right. I'm
Okay.
groping for the words, but
You're very into the intent,
yeah,
but we're dealing with the action
with the
at
practice.
this point, the practice. It's all about the
Okay, I
practice.
got it.
Okay, so that
Thank
I'm just
you.
trying to clarify. I just want to make sure you
No,
got it clear.
I appreciate it.
Okay, so so this is the Mishnah in about Megillah, that we have a statement here that says everyone can read the Megillah except a Cheresh Shoitev a Katan, and Rabbi Yehuda allows a Katan to read the Megillah. Now, what does this Mishnah mean? Let's talk about the deaf person. The deaf person cannot read the Megillah for other people. He's not kosher to read the Megillah for other people. Does this Mishnah mean what happens if he did read it for other people? Did they fulfill their obligation after the fact? Or does this Mishnah mean no, even after the fact, they don't fulfill their obligation? Again, we could read this Mishnah to talk about preferable way to read the Megillah. Is it a preferable way for a cheresh, a person who's deaf, to read the Megillah for others? No, the Mishnah says no. He's not kosher to read the Megillah for others. It's not preferable. What happens if he did? Well, it could be that he's fulfilled the mitzvah. That's one way of reading this Mishnah. Another way of reading the Mishnah is no. This is talking about bottom line. Everyone is kosher to read the Megillah, except a cheresh that even if he reads it, he has not fulfilled the obligation. So you may say, well, why does it say everyone is kosher to read the Megillah? Let it pick a better wording. It should say, if these people read the Megillah, they have fulfilled the obligation, except those people. In other words, if it spoke about the past tense, then we would know we're talking about bottom line after the fact. But it talks about everyone is kosher to read the Megillah. It talks about the future tense. Therefore, it's definitely a little vague. We're talking about the preferable state, and we're not clarifying what happens after the fact. Again, we're talking about before it happened, and we're saying don't read it. Hakol ksherim likrois, to read it. Everyone is kosher to read, except a deaf person is not kosher to read the Megillah. But what happens after the fact, we don't know, because we're talking about future tense, and we're not talking about a case of past tense. So that's what we're going to be dealing with now. Again, we dealt with these type of cases earlier, yesterday in the previous Gemara. Now we're going to be jumping right back into these type of cases, and it's really a repetition of the previous Gemara. So if you missed yesterday's and you didn't catch on to yesterday's so well, today you will have a second chance to catch on, because a lot of it is very similar and it comes to the same conclusion. Any questions? Okay, so let me read.
Can I ask one thing, Rabbi?
Yes.
Can I ask one thing?
Yes. Yes.
Did somebody make a leniency for this year's Purim because of the COVID-19, that people couldn't leave the house and didn't know and didn't have anybody to read the Megillah for them? Is it possible that was the leniency? I don't know.
Well, I'm not aware of any leniency that
Okay.
they relied on this year. Generally, the concept of a leniency is that there is some view that okays certain things, and so a leniency would mean that we can rely maybe on that view. even though under normal circumstances, we try to be stringent and cover other views, but because of a serious circumstance, we rely on certain lenient views. So the question is, which view would you be referring to that we would rely on? What are we thinking that they could rely on? And then we would say, well, maybe because of a serious circumstance, but I'm not aware of any leniency that people relied on this year. The idea of a microphone, there basically are anyone that understands how the electronics work and a speaker system works. This decides, all the rabbis that understood the mechanism, they paskin, they gave a verdict that it's not kosher for Megillah. So there might be views that might have said that it is kosher for Megillah in 100 years ago, and those views basically didn't understand the mechanism. So they're not even valid to rely on, even in a complicated circumstance. So basically, right. As far as I know, there were no leniencies. The only thing was that there were ways of figuring out how to read the Megillah. If you own a kosher Megillah, you borrowed a kosher Megillah, you could listen to it being read and read along inside. So that's not a leniency. That's kosher 100%. Maybe during normal years, no one ever did it because it's much easier just to go to shul. But there were ways of fulfilling the obligation of Megillah this year. But it's not a leniency. That's 100% kosher. Okay, so
I just meant as far as the child goes. That's all.
Oh, if a child read it,
The leniency was for a child to read it.
oh,
I'm saying that's the only leniency I was talking.
I don't know what the final halacha is about a child. I'd have to look
Okay.
it up, and I don't want to take any time away. By the way, I did. If Howard is here, I don't see him. But if he's here, I see his name is on the thing. I did look up that the halacha is that for brachos, a person is supposed to hear the bracha. So getting back to you from yesterday's question.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm here. I'm having some problems with my video.
Oh, okay, no problem. Yeah, one of the surveys actually said we don't like when people don't show themselves on the screen. Like, what are they doing? Just turning it on and doing other things. So I personally also like when people make themselves visible. It's nice to see your students.
Normally you see me, I'm just having some problems today.
Yeah, no problem, Howard. If a person can't, they can't. And if a person's on the phone, and the phone doesn't have video, of course. But if you can, we always like to see people. And it's nice and uplifting. So in any event, the halacha is that a person should hear the bracha that they say, that they recite. After the fact, if they didn't hear it, they fulfill the obligation, but it is a part of the halacha to actually hear the bracha that you say. Okay,
Thank
so
you, Rabbi.
Try to look up about a child reading Megillah, what the final halacha is, Ben, but I'm not going to look it up now and take away from our precious time. Okay, so I'm going to start again from 3 lines up from the bottom of the page to get the whole flow. So 3 lines up from the bottom. Tanan Hassam, we learned over there in Tractate Megillah. Hakol Ksherim, Likreis Es HaMegillah, Chutz Mechere Sheita V'Katan. I believe this is also a Mishnah somewhere else, I think in Erchin, but it doesn't say it on the side, surprisingly enough, at least on my Gemara. But anyway, the Mishnah says that everyone is kosher to read the Megillah, except a cheresh, a deaf person, shaita, v'katan, a shaita, a imbecile, v'katan, and a child. Rabbi Yehuda machsher b'katan. Rabbi Yehuda says a katan is able to read the Megillah for others. And again, the Mishnah is talking about in the preferable way that it's not preferable for these people to read the Megillah. Man tana cheresh, the eved nami loy. So the Gemara says, who is the author of this Mishnah that says that even after the fact, a cheresh, a deaf person, should not read the Megillah? So the Gemara's first way of learning the Mishnah is that it's saying both, preferably and after the fact, it would not be right for a cheresh, a deaf person, to read the Megillah. So the Gemara says, who is the author of this Mishnah that even after the fact, a deaf person should not, you're not fulfilled your obligation if a deaf person read the Megillah? Amar Rav Masner, Rabbi Yosi, Rav Masner says, this is Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi is the author of this Mishnah, which makes sense because Rabbi Yosi says by Shema, you did not fulfill your obligation if you did not hear yourself. The same thing would be by Megillah. You can't hear yourself. You're deaf. You cannot fulfill the obligation for others to read the Megillah because you didn't fulfill it. You didn't fulfill the obligation. Rabbi Yosi D'Tanan, because we learned in a Mishnah, which is actually our Mishnah that we have earlier on our page. A person read the Shema and he didn't hear it. Yatsa, he fulfilled his obligation to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosi Amar Lo Yatsa. Rabbi Yosi says you have not fulfilled your obligation. So now the Gemara says, okay, that sounds very nice that this Mishnah fits with Rabbi Yosi. But who says that you read the Mishnah about Megillah correctly? Why don't you say that the Mishnah that talks about Megillah is only talking about in the preferable way of reading the Megillah? But maybe after the fact, maybe a deaf person who read the Megillah after the fact, he fulfilled his obligation, and other people who listened fulfilled their obligation. Let's say that after the fact, it's okay. How do you know to say that this follows Rabbi Yossi's view when it's talking about after the fact that you did not fulfill your obligation? Maybe it's only talking about the preferable way. Dilma, now we turn the page. Dilma Rabbi Yehuda, maybe this goes like Rabbi Yehuda. We're on 15b now. Maybe the Mishnah that talks about Megillah, that if a person read the Megillah who was deaf, maybe after the fact he fulfilled his obligation. The Mishnah is talking about what's preferable. It's talking about preferably is that he should not read it. Hadiyeved, but if he read it, shaper dummy, it is considered good. And therefore, maybe it goes like Rabbi Yehuda. What did Rabbi Yehuda say regarding Shema? Rabbi Yehuda said regarding Shema, preferable to hear yourself say the Shema. At least that's one way of understanding Rabbi Yehuda's view. Rabbi Yehuda says it's preferable to hear the Shema, but if you did not hear it, you fulfilled your obligation. So maybe that's the same view as this Mishnah about a deaf person reading the Megillah. It's preferable he shouldn't read the Megillah, but if he did, he fulfilled his obligation and he fulfilled the obligation of those listening. So maybe it's Rabbi Yehuda. So again, is it Rabbi Yosi? Maybe. Is it Rabbi Yehuda? Sounds like that could be also. Are we talking about the preferable way of reading Megillah or after the fact? It's unclear. It could be either. And therefore it could be Rabbi, it seems like it could be Rabbi Yehuda. So how do you know to say it's Rabbi Yosi? So the Gemara is going to try to prove itself, but then it's going to ultimately, it goes back and forth. So let's see. The Gemara first says, Loi salka daituch. It did not go up in your mind to say that we're talking about only preferable, but not after the fact. Diktani cheresh dumya deshaita v'katan. Because it says cheresh, similar to a shaita and a katan. Now, what about a shaita, an imbecile? If he read the Megillah, would you think after the fact you fulfilled your obligation? No. A shaita, pretty obvious you didn't fulfill your obligation. So therefore, the Gemara says, if it says cheresh next to it, we're probably talking about the same law. The same law applies to a shaita and a cheresh, a imbecile and a deaf person. And so, ma shaita v'katan diavad namilai, just like a shaita and a katan, even after the fact, you didn't fulfill your obligation. Av cheresh, also a cheresh, a deaf person, diavad namilai, also after the fact, would not fulfill his obligation. Yes, Miranda.
So they're assuming this person is a deaf mute from birth. and can't learn anything, I'm assuming. Is that right?
No, because if that was the case, then they would be included in the case of shaita. It wouldn't even have to say it. But we're talking about the fact that it puts them next to each other in the same category. That's why we're assuming the law would be the same, but not the same reason. In other words, the shaita is totally excluded. A cheresh, you would have more logic, more reason to say maybe they could be included, but no, we're putting them in the same category. And therefore, the Gemara is saying, oh, if they're put next to each other, probably both of them, even after the fact, have not fulfilled their obligation. But the Gemara says, but that's not a good enough proof just because it's put it next to each other. But Dilman, maybe Hakidisa, Hakidisa. This one follows their laws. The shaita, the imbecile, has his laws, and the katan, and the cheresh has his laws. Just because I put it next to each other doesn't mean everything is going to be the same laws. Regarding this, is it preferable for them to read the Megillah? No, it is not preferable for them to read the Megillah. They should both of them should not read the Megillah. In this scenario, they're in the same category. Are they in the same category if they read it, that you did not fulfill the obligation? No, not necessarily. Maybe the shaita, the imbecile, didn't fulfill his obligation, but maybe the cheresh, the person who's deaf, maybe he did fulfill his obligation. And maybe hakidisa v'hakidisa. This one is like it says about it, and that one is like it says about it, and therefore they're not necessarily gonna have the same law after the fact. Okay, umi matzis lo'ukma Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara now tries again to say it can't be Rabbi Yehuda. Is it possible to say this follows Rabbi Yehuda's view? And we're talking about that it's only not preferable for a deaf person to read the Megillah, but really it would fulfill his obligation if he did. But since in the end of the Mishnah it says Rabbi Yehuda machshir b'katan, Rabbi Yehuda permits a katan to read the Megillah, he says it's kosher. Michlal, that implies the Reish Alav Rabbi Yehuda, the beginning part of the Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda, because then it would say it wouldn't say Rabbi Yehuda says, because it's all Rabbi Yehuda, right? So that's a very good point. How could we say that the first opinion of the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda if that's the second view? Think about it. Rabbi Yehuda says everyone is kosher to read the Megillah except a cheresh, shaita, and a katan. Rabbi Yehuda permits a katan. That's a crazy statement. Rabbi Yehuda said the first thing, and Rabbi Yehuda says the second thing, and that's a contradiction. The first thing says a katan is not kosher. The second thing says Rabbi Yehuda permits a katan. In other words, if Rabbi Yehuda said the first statement, how could it say Rabbi Yehuda says this statement? It's, for number one, it doesn't make sense to say Rabbi Yehuda's name twice. And number two, it's a contradiction. Does he permit a katan or does he prohibit a katan from reading the Megillah? So it can't be Rabbi Yehuda. At least that's what the Gemara thinks now. But the Gemara says, no, it's possible. Sometimes you have to understand that the Mishnahs were written very concisely. And there is a style of the Mishnah to say something like this. And the way to read it is meant to be read with adding the missing words in it, meaning that the Mishnah was always taught in a very concise way, and there was almost like a code. And the code includes a way to read the Mishnah a little differently. What is the code way of reading the Mishnah that it would fit? So the code way of reading the Mishnah, and we do find very often that the Mishnayos are explained this way, and therefore the Gemara is not surprised to say maybe it's following this specific code. What is the code that we would be able to read the Mishnah and it would flow? It would go like this: V'dilma kula Rabbi Yehudahi. Maybe the whole Mishnah that it talks about reading the Megillah, it's all Rabbi Yehuda's view. Utrei gavni katan. And really, there's two types of a child who reads the Megillah. And v'chasure mechzera, and it's missing words, v'hachi katani, and this is the way it would be taught. This is how it is studied. This Mishnah. Hakoil ksherim likreis es haMegillah. Everyone is kosher to read the Megillah, chutz mecheresh shoyte b'katan, except it's not preferable for a cheresh, a deaf person, a shoyte b'katan, a imbecile, and a child to read the Megillah. B'amed dvarim amurim. When does this apply that a child shouldn't read the Megillah? B'katan shaloi higia l'chinuch, a child that has not reached the age of chinuch, where he's able to be educated to read the Megillah. And Rashi over here mentions that that's 9 years old or 10 years old. That would be approximately the time of chinuch. And I mentioned before that for reading the Megillah, it would be like a child listening to the Megillah when he could maybe like Sitzfleisch. I'm not sure if that's the exact wording that it uses. It was more of a understanding of a child's chinuch education. It could be that it's when a child would be able to read that large amount of writing. I should look it up really to know the exact precise meaning of chinuch for Megillah. So I'm going to try to look that up. What is the exact time, the rule of what chinuch is for reading the Megillah? Is it reading that amount? So in other words, like for shaking the lulav, it had to do with remembering, knowing the 6 directions and how to shake it properly. Megillah would be something to do with reading or hearing the Megillah. So I'm going to have to look it up exactly. And that's maybe the meaning of a child who is not preferable for them to read the Megillah. Aval katan shehigia l'chinuch, but a child that reached that age of education, afilu lechatchila kasher, maybe even the Mishnah is saying, even preferably, that would be okay for a child who reached the age of chinuch to read the Megillah. Divrei Reb Yehuda, these are the words of Reb Yehuda. Share Reb Yehuda machshir bekatan, because Reb Yehuda permits a katan to read the Megillah, and that he's talking about a katan that reached the age of chinuch. He is allowed to read the Megillah even on a preferable, even as a preferable level for others. So that would be the way to read the Mishnah with this code. In other words, we initially said it doesn't make sense that Rabbi Yehuda would be the author of the Mishnah, but because it's common for Mishnahs to be written very concisely, and they sometimes follow this path that it's one opinion, the entire Mishnah is one opinion, and the Mishnah concludes at the end by saying, because this view permits this thing. That's why this is the law, because Rabbi Yehuda permits a katan. So in other words, that's how we would fit those words in the Mishnah. And we would have to add, of course, a few words by saying there's 2 types of a child. There's a child that didn't reach the age of education, and there's a child that did reach the age of education. And we would say, but the entire Mishnah flows with that one view. And therefore, we could say that this Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, and it's talking about preferable, and we don't really know what would be after the fact if they did it. And it would make sense if it's Rabbi Yehuda, it follows the same laws as the Mishnah regarding Shema, that after the fact you fulfill your obligation of Shema. The same thing would apply with Megillah. After the fact that a deaf person read the Shema, read the Megillah, he fulfilled the obligation for himself and for others after the fact, and then it would fit with Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says that B'mayu kimta Rabbi Yehuda. What are we explaining it to be the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda v'diavad in l'chatchila loy, and this would fit that this would go as a it would be okay for a deaf person to read the Megillah after the fact, but preferably he shouldn't. Ela hadatani Rabbi Yehuda, but this other statement from Reb Yehuda in the name of the son of Reb Shimon ben Pazi, where he says about Truma. Now we're going back to the case of Truma. He says, it says that a deaf person that speaks but can't hear, he can take Truma lechatchila. He can preferably separate Truma. Who would that go like? Mani. If you're going to say that Rabbi Yehuda says his opinion only as that it's preferable, that it's really preferable to be able to hear yourself, and only after the fact you fulfill your obligation. Then what about truma? Truma, there's a Mishnah or a brisa that says that it's preferable for a deaf person to take truma. Who would that go like? If Rabbi Yehuda only permits it after the fact, so who's going to be the author of that Mishnah? Mani, who will it be? Loi Rabbi Yehuda, Loi Rabbi Yosi. It can't be Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda only permits it after the fact, and Rabbi Yosi prohibits it even after the fact. So for sure, it can't go like either of them. Rabbi Yehuda, the Eved in lechatchila loy. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, then it only works after the fact. The Eved after the fact, yes, it's good. Lechatchila, but preferably loy, you can't do it. Rabbi Yosi, if it would be Rabbi Yosi, the Eved nami loy, even after the fact, it's not good. And here we have a statement about truma that for Rabbi Yehuda, that it's even good as a preferable way. So the Gemara says, Elamai, Rabbi Yehuda, who's it going to go like? Who do you want it to go like? Rabbi Yehuda? Va'afilo lechatchila? And you're going to say it even goes it's even preferable to do this? You're going to say that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda always permits a deaf person to do mitzvahs, and it's preferable? That's considered preferable? Eloha Tanya, but then you're going to have a problem with the brisa that said, a person cannot say the blessing of grace after meal with only his lips if he doesn't hear it. And if he said it, Yatsa, he did fulfill his obligation. So here we have this intermediate opinion where it's better not to, but if you did it, you fulfilled your obligation. Mani, who is that going to go like? If Rabbi Yehuda says even preferably a person can't hear, they can do mitzvahs. And Rabbi Yosi says even after the fact, they can't do the mitzvah. So who's going to be this middle view that says it's preferable not to, but after the fact, you fulfilled it? If you want to say Rabbi Yehuda only talks about preferable, that even it's preferable even to do mitzvahs, even if you can't hear. So who's going to be the middle view? Mani la Rabbi Yehuda la Rabbi Yosi. Who's going to be the middle view that we see clearly? There's a middle view regarding grace after meals. Rabbi Yehuda, if you're going to say it goes like Rabbi Yehuda, ha'amar afilu lechatchila nami. Rabbi Yehuda says even lechatchila, even preferably, it's also fine. In the grace after meal case, we said it's not preferable. Rabbi Yosi, and if you want to say it follows Rabbi Yosi, he says even after the fact it's not good. So we've got a problem with the fact that we have two names, two opinions. We have two names and we got three opinions here. And we have to figure out what is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Does he fit with this one and does he fit with that one? And however he fits, who's the third view? So the Gemara answers, Loi li'olam Rabbi Yehuda. Really, Rabbi Yehuda, this follows Rabbi Yehuda that even preferably a deaf person can separate truma. Va'afilu lechatchila nami, even preferably. V'loi kasha, and it's not a question. Hadidei hadirabe. This would be his own view, and this would be his teachers, his Rebbe's view. The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, HaKoirei Yashema, if a person reads the Shema, Tzarech sheyashmiya la'oznai, preferably he should hear it with his ears. Shenemar, as it says, Shema Yisrael, listen, he should hear it. And Amar Loi Reb Meir, Hareu Aimer, Reb Meir told him back, he says, oh really, you're supposed to hear it preferably? It says, Asher Anochi Mitzavcha Hayoim Al Levavecha. It says it should be on your heart. You don't have to hear it. Everything goes after the intent. As long as you have kavanah, you don't have to hear it. Say the words and have in mind. You don't have to hear it. So basically, we have clearly a statement from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah that after that preferably you should hear it, but after the fact it's okay. So we're going to now divide the three opinions as Rabbi Yehuda is the most lenient. It's even preferable. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who's Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, he's going to say a middle view that it's preferable not to have a deaf person do the mitzvahs, but if they did it, it's okay. And we have Rabbi Yosi, who's the most stringent, and he would say even after the fact, you have not fulfilled your obligation. But now the Gemara says Hashta the asis lahachi. Now that we've come to here and we've figured out that there's a view of Reb Meir, afilu tema Reb Yehuda karabe. You could even say that Reb Yehuda, like his Rebbe, Sphirale, he holds. You could even say that Reb Yehuda follows the view of his Rebbe, that Reb Yehuda will be the middle view. V'loy kasha, and it's not a question who's going to be the lenient view. Reb Yehuda, Reb Meir. Reb Yehuda could be the intermediate view, and this other opinion is Reb Meir, who's the lenient view. Amar Rav Chizda, Amar Rav Shela, halacha to Reb Yehuda. Rav Chizda says in the name of Rav Shela, the halacha is like Reb Yehuda, Sha'amar Mishum, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says things and said his statement in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and the halacha to Reb Yehuda, and the halacha is like Reb Yehuda. So the conclusion is that there's three views. There's the view of Reb Meir, who's the most lenient. The middle view, who's Reb Yehuda and Reb Yehuda's Rebbe, and it's preferable not to, but if you did, it's okay regarding a deaf person. And then we have the final view of Reb Yossi, who says it's never good for a deaf person to do the mitzvah, and he was not able to fulfill the obligation for others. Now, the Gemara concluded that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, who says it in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, which is an interesting thing. Why are you redundant here? You said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda in the name of his Rebbe, and the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Sounds to me like it's a little redundant or possibly even contradictory, because Rabbi Yehuda himself, we don't really know what his view is. Maybe he argues on his Rebbe. And here you're saying, number one is the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, who says stuff and who said his statement in the name of his Rebbe, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And you said again, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. So what does this mean? So the Gemara tries to figure this out. Utricha, we need to know both. We need both statements. Why do we need both statements? The Iash min halacha of Rabbi Yehuda. If it said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, hava mina afilu lachatchila, I wouldn't know what it really means, because Rabbi Yehuda's view is we're a little in the dark. It's a little vague. So we might think that even Rabbi Yehuda holds that even preferably a deaf person could say the Shema, and deaf person could read the Megillah, and deaf person could do everything. And therefore, we can't say just halacha to Rabbi Yehuda, halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. We can't say that. Kamash Malon, so it comes to let us hear. Rav Chizda, in the name of Rav Shela, comes to let us hear. I'm not going to say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. I'm going to say halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda that says in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda sham mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Ve'iash min halacha Rabbi Yehuda sham mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So what happens if it just said that statement? The halacha like Rabbi Yehuda, who says in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, hava amina sarich ve'ein loy takana. I wouldn't know what would be the law after the fact. I would think you have to do it this way, and that you have to hear it. You have to hear the Shema with your ears, and I wouldn't know what would be the law after the fact if you said Shema and you didn't hear it. I would think there's no way of fixing it, or I need to fix it. Kamash Malan, halacha to Rabbi Yehuda, it comes and lets us hear that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore you fulfill the obligation after the fact. Let me just translate those words again. Let me just read that one more time, the last line that I just read. If we only said the halacha like Rabbi Yehuda, name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, which would mean that it's preferable to hear it with your ears, to say Shema and hear it. Hava amina, I would think sarech ve'ein loy takana. You need to do it this way, and there's no fixing up. It's not good even after the fact. Ve'ein loy takana, it's not okay even after the fact. Kamash Malan halacha Rabbi Yehuda, that it's okay even after the fact. Amar Rabbi Yosef says, B'kriyas Shema, machlokes b'kriyas Shema. The argument that we're dealing with is regarding Shema, Avo b'shar mitzvahs divrei hakol lo yatsa. Regarding other mitzvahs, everyone would agree that if you didn't hear it, you did not fulfill your obligation. D'chsiv, as it says, haskes u'shma Yisrael. It says in another place, not the mitzvah of Shema, but regarding all mitzvahs, it says, haskes u'shma Yisrael. Listen, Jewish people, you got to fulfill the mitzvahs. So why does it say listen? Haskes, which means give your attention. U'shma Yisrael, and listen to the other mitzvahs. It means that everyone agrees you got to hear it. So the Gemara asks, Meisvei, let me ask you a contradiction. Lo yevarich adam berchas hamazon b'liboy v'im berich yatsa. We see clearly by berchas hamazon, grace after meals, if a person made the bracha and they did not hear it, they did fulfill their obligation after the fact, which is a statement we just read a little earlier. So how could you say all other mitzvahs you're not even fulfilling even after the fact? You do fulfill it after the fact. Ella, rather, you know what? We said it wrong. I itmar, hachi itmar. The Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, let's rephrase that. If we learned it this way, the Gemara says. Amar Reb Yosef says, machlekes b'kriyas shema. There is an argument about kriyas shema, because by kriyas shema it says the chsiv Shema Yisrael. It says Shema Yisrael. Therefore, there's reason to say you have to hear it with your ears. And if you didn't, you did not fulfill your obligation, according to one view. Or you have to hear it with your ears. If you didn't, you did fulfill your obligation. Maybe there's an argument regarding kriyas shema, because it does say the word Shema Yisrael. Abel b'shar mitzvahs, other mitzvahs, divrei hakoil yatsa. Everyone says you did fulfill your obligation by other mitzvahs. You always fulfill your obligation. Shema, you have to hear. It says Shema Yisrael. Other mitzvahs, you always fulfill your obligation, even if you don't hear. As we see by Berchas Hamazon, you didn't hear it, you fulfilled your obligation. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? Well, Shema Yisrael. By other mitzvahs, it says you have to hear it. It says give your attention and listen. And you see from there that other mitzvahs, you have to listen, you have to hear them. So you need to hear other mitzvahs as well. It also says Shema, just like by Shema it says Shema, and there's an argument. By other mitzvahs, the same thing. You have to hear it, and there should be the same argument. So the Gemara answers, no, that verse that says Haskesu Shema Hahu b'divrei Torah ksiv, that's talking about divrei Torah, that you should hear yourself saying words of Torah. That you should hear yourself saying words of Torah for the mitzvah of Torah. But other mitzvahs, maybe you fulfill even if you didn't hear them, even according to the view that says you didn't fulfill your obligation by Shema, maybe you would fulfill your obligations by other mitzvahs, because it doesn't say the word Shema by other mitzvahs, and therefore maybe you don't have to hear it with your ears after the fact, and only by Shema you need to hear it with your ears after the fact, according to that view. So that really concludes this Gemara, and I know I went a little faster than I normally go.
You think?
But I wanted to give you the full Gemara. You need to have that in one seating, in one in one session. And if I think it gave you enough that if you go over it with your English Gemaras, I think you'll be able to cover it again. It's a real.
You are very clear. You were very clear in it.
Thank you. It's a repetition of yesterday's Gemara. So it really is like the same Gemara going back over the same stuff and asking the same questions and coming up with the same conclusion. And this way we can move a little, and maybe a miracle will happen and we'll be able to finish. Yes. Yes, Moshe.
Now, there's two kinds of being deaf. The person who comes in and he's not hearing what he's saying, he's not conceptualizing what he's saying. He's had a bad day and he can't hear what he's saying it, but he doesn't hear. And then there's the person who's deaf, who really can't hear. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says that even after the fact that this is all right. I mean, that he's, after it's said, it's considered as though he said it, and it's acceptable.
Right.
Both of them
we're
for both
talking,
That's what
cases?
his rabbi said.
well, we're not really talking about the case where a person had a bad day. We're talking about a case where a person can't hear himself. And even in that case, like that person read the Megillah, that person said grace after meal, that person said Shema, they have fulfilled.
Is it Doraita, the mitzvot are Doraita, or they're
Both.
not? I mean,
We're connecting this to all mitzvahs because the rabbis established their rules similar to the biblical laws, and therefore they obligated a person to to follow the way things are, even biblically, and therefore after the fact, if you fulfill the mitzvah by Shema, you fulfill the mitzvah by the other mitzvahs as well after after the fact. And we're talking about a person can't hear, and yet he fulfills the mitzvah. The person who had a bad day and it's hard for him to concentrate, maybe he might have an issue with the first verse of Shema, that you're supposed to have concentration, that you're fulfilling a mitzvah, and so on. But the rest of the Shema doesn't really carry that much obligation to have intent. And therefore, as long as you said the words with your mouth, you fulfilled your obligation. And here we say, even if you didn't hear it, and additionally, the law would be even if you weren't thinking about it, since you said the first verse together with the Baruch Shem, and you had in mind to fulfill the mitzvah, that would be the main. And you had in mind, of course, accepting the yoke of heaven. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. You're accepting the yoke of heaven. That's enough. And even though you had a bad day, you're fulfilling the
I
mitzvah.
see. Okay.
Many people drift off a little during Shema, be honest with you. So it's not, it's not even without a bad day, very, very, very common people to drift off a little. Okay.
Rabbi Smith, can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes, I can, Reb
Oh,
Shlomo
good.
Yosef.
Yes, I'm listening, and the Mishnah doesn't say anything about a woman reading a Megillah.
Ah.
In this age of egalitarianism, women should be allowed to read the Megillah.
That's right. That's right. So there's a lot of discussion about it. I see you like to bring up controversial topics.
For the sake
wanna
of
bring-
discussion,
You want to bring some
I'm glad
excitement
you're-
here. Bring a little excitement. Yes. Anyway, so
Right.
there's a lot of discussion about it, but this would be a proof that they are allowed to read the Megillah and be moitzi and even have in mind others.
right?
This would be one of the proofs. The discussion is
Could a woman like Moshe Rabbeinu's mother be a male?
be a mile. Oh, so it's also discussed about a woman doing the bris.
Yes.
If I once looked it up, and the bris is, if I remember correctly, they don't say the bracha on the milah, but you're saying like Moshe Rabbeinu's wife, that she did the bris on their son, right, on their second son.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah,
And could a woman be a sheikhet?
right. Interesting.
Hakol shochin chutz mechedi sheikhet katan.
Right. So there's a Talmudic statement it takes about 2 pages of the Talmud in the beginning of Tractate Erchin, and it goes through all of these statements. Everyone can do this, and everyone can do that, and everyone can build a sukkah, and everyone can, it goes through all of these things. And in each of those, and that's really where the discussion is about a woman reading the Megillah. It's in the Tosfos over there, and all the commentaries on top of that Tosfos. And that's where we could look and see the conclusion about all these cases. Can everyone, if everyone can do this, would that include, could a woman do this, and could an eved, a person who's a slave, could they do that? And could they, all the cases. A child, can a child do this mitzvah? And hakol mezamnin, everyone can do a zimun. Would that include a child? It goes through all of these cases. So it's the first 2 pages of one of the tractates. So if you're ever bored or you want to learn that area, that field, you could go through each one and go, in detail and look them up. But thank you for bringing that up. Very interesting. Yes.
Rabbi?
Yes, Phyllis.
Thank you very much. How do,
So it's
how do I make
clear,
myself
so
visible?
it's clear
Oh,
then
I'm
with
sorry.
respect to the deaf
Phyllis,
person.
hold on one second. Phyllis, hold on one second. What did you ask, Shlomi Yosef?
How do I make myself visible?
Visible. Oh, well, if you're able to get a Zoom on your cell phone or on a computer, you will be able, now you just dialed in. You called into our session, which is great. But if you're able to have someone help you with getting Zoom on your cell phone or on a computer, you would actually be able to see us and we could see you. So that would be really nice. You might want to look into that. Maybe
Yes.
ask your activity director and so on. That what they would need to do would be download Zoom on your phone, and then you just punch in the Zoom number, which is that 823 number that you punched in after you dialed the phone number. You punched in an 823 11-digit number. So that's all you would need to do the Zoom. So yeah, look, that would be really
Okay.
nice if we could see you. Okay, and
I wanted
Phyllis,
to add,
you had a
I want to
question.
get clarification on this.
Yes.
With respect to the deaf person.
Yeah.
They are allowed, or they're chayav, or they're considered to have heard it if they are present during the reading of the Megillah, or they can read it themselves. I'm not clear.
Yeah, that's a very good question. What should a deaf person do? If they're deaf, how do they fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah? I should also clarify that when we're talking about a deaf person, we're talking about someone who's totally deaf, not if they're a little hard of hearing. They're hard of hearing. It's not a leniency. But if they're totally deaf, the way to read what they really should do, if I'm not mistaken, is they're supposed to read the Megillah themselves because they're not going to be able to hear someone else reading it. Let me just see if I'm. They should read it themselves, even if they read it without the notes, and they could read it themselves with a bracha. Interesting. This is brought in a biur halacha that they could read it with a bracha. I'll have to look it up, but that's what it says here. That it seems like that would be the way for them to fulfill the mitzvah of reading the Megillah. And in general, a deaf person who can hear, a deaf person who can speak is obligated in all the mitzvahs of the Torah, but they should not fulfill other people's obligation of hearing the Megillah, at least preferably.
Well,
Not preferable. What?
Oh, I understand. Thank God.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Oh, Rabbi Smith.
Yes.
Hello. Yes. What do you got for Thursdays and Friday? What is the lectures about?
So the morning lectures is Gemara, and Thursday half of it is Tanya, and Friday is completely Gemara. Most of the days in the morning are just Gemara. Sunday and Thursday is Tanya, and the afternoon sessions. Today is a sticha, a lecture from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a essay from the Rebbe for in the afternoon, at 3 o'clock. And tomorrow is the laws of Shabbos.